Welcome, Palladium fans. I'm here again with Kevin, and we're continuing in the history of Palladium books. And today we're talking about Palladium Fantasy. I did not have to practice that. I did point to the correct book. Normally, I get confused which way I'm supposed to point while I'm doing this. I'm going to give myself a little kudos here in the morning. So today we're actually talking about the Palladium Fantasy Game. Do you want to do a brief recap of how this, what the origins of at least the system where you were playing D&D, you were in those early days, everybody was house ruling. Yeah. There's so many great games and little treasures that came out of those early days of role playing, but Palladium, Fantasy Game is one of them.
Yeah, I would say so. So I had met Julius Rosenstein, and he got me into playing D&D, and I met Eric, and he and I and 6 other folks or so founded the Detroit Gaming Center, which was just this great hothouse of ideas and gaming. Whatever new game book came out, somebody would bring it in. I mean, we had typical weekends where 200 people would come through our door. That's like a small convention.
It is a small, yeah.
Yeah, it was beautiful. And that happened every single weekend. So it was really cool to see all these different people and their gaming style and all the new releases coming out. And, we would look at everything that walked through that door, every person, every product. So it was fantastic. And I started playing a D&D fantasy game. But very quickly, almost immediately, I started to have issues with a lot of the mechanics. For one thing, I liked the concept of storytelling. I love stories. I'm a natural born storyteller with art, with writing, with the combination. And that seemed to be very lacking in D&D, which makes sense. It was born out of, war games, miniature games. So it kind of makes sense.
And it was more episodic, right? The idea is that each of these modules were kind of isolated from each other. And it was more of, looking back, what was the story we told? Not very much like we were talking about with comic books, where it's like, hey, we have a plan that's going forward, kind of arcing over here like a story.
No, that's exactly right, JM. So it was, a very random kind of scattershot, and only company that was really doing adventure modules was Judges Guild.
Mm-hmm.
And granted, they were cranking them out at a pretty fast pace, but you didn't have a lot of other choices. And I would look at that and go, I don't know, these modules look okay, but they're not as cool as I want to do things. And I just, coming from the comic book background that I did, I loved that whole episodic thing. Like, one of the things I would introduce in my game was returning villains.
Yeah.
Which everyone thought was like revolutionary. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Green Goblin, Dr. Doom,
Stanley and Jack Kirby have been doing this since the 40s.
Yeah, exactly. And so had TV and soap operas and, the whole 9 yards. So I didn't think I was doing anything particularly revolutionary, but apparently I was. So I started to make, as you said, house rules. That was very common. If you didn't like something, well, just tweak it, make it different. And there's nothing wrong with that. And by the way, I highly encourage it. That's why I never get upset when someone comes up to me and say, I love your game worlds, but, I use it with Savage Worlds, or I use it with World of Darkness rules, or, whatever it is. I don't care. If you're having fun and you're playing in my world, awesome.
Yeah. I was just reading through Creature Feature for Beyond the Supernatural 2nd edition, and you have this whole, in the middle of the book, there's this, hey, we're going to clarify a bunch of rules. But then you and the other author kind of are like, well, here's how I do critical hits. Well, I don't agree with that. Here's how I do critical hits. But it's this discussion back and forth on, hey, play it the way you want to play it and move forward. Yeah.
Well, role-playing is really very personal. Everyone has their own style. Every gaming group is going to have different tendencies to what they want to play or what they love to play. Some people may be more into mysteries and puzzles and figuring things out. Others are more action. Some are power gamers. Some want more like murder mystery, noir. All of that's fine. It's great. Don't limit yourself to any one thing or any one preconceived notion. It's that line of thought that would eventually lead to riffs.
Yeah.
But right now I'm focused on fantasy. And I start changing all kinds of rules. I introduce my own alignment system. I introduce my own attributes. I introduce new skills. I introduce psionics. I changed the way magic works with potential psychic energy. Yep. Although I don't think I necessarily called it that right away. I don't remember it. I have to look through some of my ancient notes. But we were just having a lot of fun. And in my game group, I didn't even realize this. And then one day, a bunch of my guys in my gaming group said, hey, Kev, this isn't D&D anymore. This is your own thing. And it's cool. We love it. And I'm like, yeah, thanks. And they're like, you should try to sell it. And I thought, okay, I'll try to sell it. So we had a big convention run by the, Detroit Metro Gamers. It was a big club, and they would run WinterCon and SummerCon, and this happened obviously in the winter and the summer, and they would get like a lot of people. They would get 1,500 to 2,500 people.
It's a good sized convention, especially in the early days of gaming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. In fact, it was so big that I think it was in 1984 that Origins joined forces with them to host. Once upon a time, Origins used to travel the country.
Yeah.
And in 1984, they decided to have it in Detroit because there was such a huge gaming fan base. And Detroit Metro Gamers were part of that, and Eric and I were part of that. And it was pretty awesome. In fact, I did the T-shirt, which was like a dragon driving a race car. We had the Renaissance Center in the back, and it was pretty cool. But so I went to WinterCon, I think it was. And I pitched it to everyone who was there because back in the day, a lot of the actual owners of these companies would be there.
Yeah,
which was nice. But no one was interested except Bob Bledsoe at Judges Guild. So he looks, I give him my pitch and he goes, tell you what, I'll give you $500 and a 2% royalty. That royalty will drop to 1% after we sell 10,000 copies of your game. Sounds pretty good. I'm interested. And I'm like, hey, Bob, that's just not enough. I'm not going to give away my game.
Yeah.
And I already had the concept to make it like a megaversal game where you could eventually incorporate everything into it. Magic, technology, cyborgs, horror, the whole 9 yards. And he goes, that's the best I can do. And I'm like, well, I'll pass.
Yeah.
Well, that's how I got hired by Judges Guild. He's like, hey, kid, your art's really good. Why don't you come, work for me? I have a sweatshop mentality. I only hang out 72 illustrations a month. And I was a hungry artist, anxious to break into the industry. So I'm like, okay, Bob. That's
like 2.5 illustrations a day, like every day for a full month.
Oh, it was insane. And it also, it was one of these things where I was working out of my parents' attic, which didn't have heat. It was an unfinished attic. So I was like something out of a Dickens novel. I had the gloves with the cut off fingertips.
Yeah.
And I remember Eric and a couple other gaming center people showed up and they're like, holy crap, Kev, this is crazy. And I'm like, well, I got nowhere else to draw. And
there is a reason why the starving artist is a stereotype. It's there for a reason, right? Because we're so passionate about the things we're doing, we're willing to give so much of ourselves and give up so many of the other creature comforts to refine and keep creating and make it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it is what it was.
Yeah.
And but so anyways, I report back to my gaming group and say, hey guys, it's not going to happen, but that's okay. We're having a blast. And they're like, but Kev, you have publishing experience. You've worked for a tabloid in downtown Detroit. You published your own, black and white independent comic book, 5 issues of that. You've done fanzines. You should publish it yourself. And I'm like, no, I don't know. And like a week later, it's like, yeah, I'm going to do this. But I didn't have the money to produce exactly what I wanted, because I had a very clear vision of what I wanted Palladium Fantasy to be.
Yeah.
So I came out with the Mechanoids first, and then we came out with the beginnings of the Weapon series, which was kind of good because it made the company start out slow. It was a learning process because I didn't know anything. I didn't go to school for business. I was an artist. At this point, I'm still thinking, when I grow up, I'm going to be a comic book creator. So things start to take off. Weapons and Armor is a hit. Mechanoid Invasion trilogy does okay. And I'm planning on coming out with Palladium Fantasy as a big, juicy 200-300 page core rule book. Yeah. And I also, again, a lot of what I did came out of things that I liked or didn't like from the rest of the gaming industry.
Yeah.
So I get the idea of why you would have a player manual and a game master manual and a monster manual and all these things, and people are used to it and people like it. But again, growing up as a poor kid, that's a lot of money to invest in a game that you don't know if you're really even going to enjoy that much. So I had the idea of I want to have a core rule book that is pretty much everything you need to play. Now, I'm going to create all kinds of source books for it, but you don't need them. If you just want to play what's in the main game, you're all set. And I tried to keep my price point low because, again, I knew what it was like to want to buy something and not really have the resources to do it. And it seems like a lot of gamers, especially role players, I think part of it is a demographic. A lot of them are young. Mm-hmm. So unless they have a job or they're getting an allowance, or they have parents or uncles or grandparents who are like, oh, wait, Benny, you want, these 6, books? Sure, we'll get them for you. You're kind of out in the cold if you don't have that. So I try to keep my price points low. I think the original Palladium Fantasy hardcover came out at $19.99 or $95. And so anyways, I'm planning on doing this, and I'm building up the resources to do it. And I'm thinking, in another 6 months or a year, I can do this big, juicy, perfect bound book. And one evening, I get a call from one of my defilers. It's Tom Bartold. And he says, and Tom's sort of a silly guy, great guy, but he calls me up and goes, really serious. He's like, so Kev, I've got $10,000 I'm looking to invest. And he knew that's exactly the amount of money I needed to print.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very specific number.
And he's like, so convince me why I should invest it in the Palladium Fantasy role-playing game and not buy land in Alaska. So I'm just like, oh, yeah, Tom. Oh. And I explained why. And part of it was back in those days, I would give my investors a percentage of the profit, a sizable percentage of the profit, like 20%. And I'm like, Tom, you'll get 20%. And these are the numbers I crunch is what I think will sell. And the book should sell for years. So it's not just a one-shot thing. And I'll pay you back the money as soon as I can. And I think we had a set like 3 years or 5 years. Yeah. And I said, look, this should make you piles of money, and it's going to be the game we all love and play, and blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the call, Tom's like, all right, when should I bring the check? So the next day he drops by, gives me the check. And now we can really, get things rolling. Yeah. I had the whole game system pretty much worked out. I had probably 90% of the book completely written already. So it was just a matter of getting typesetting and pasting it up, the layout. And back in those days, layout wasn't, I should have had some paste up pages. The reason it used to be called, the reason it was called paste ups is that you ran these things either through a hot wax machine and when I say things, I mean a photocopy or photostat of the artwork, the headlines, the typesetting would come in these long, what they called galleys, where there'd be these long strips. Like if you rolled it out, it'd be 30, 40 feet long.
Yeah.
And you'd cut these down and either put them through the hot waxer, which when we finally got one of those, I'm like, oh man, we're professional now. Or you'd use rubber cement, which was more messy.
Yeah.
And you'd put that on the back of it. And then you had these boards like a grid, like what you draw maps on.
Yeah.
And except I didn't even know that then. We pasted all our stuff up on just big sheets of paper. So anyways, that's what we're going to do. And I had a little hand waxer I found someplace, so I was using that, which was again more time consuming, but
yeah,
you'd burn your fingers like crazy, but that's what you had to do,
right?
And we had for the original Palladium Fantasy role playing game, Matthew Ballant, one of my cohorts in crime here, would have connections. So he knew a guy who had access to I guess it was a linotype machine where he could do professional typesetting. And we get him on this sheet. It was all a photographic process. I mean, he had chemicals and the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
So the thing is, everything was written by hand. So they had to either take my handwritten pages and pages of my handwritten notes, or I had just met the woman who would become my wife, Mary Ann, and she would sit there and look at my pages and type them all up. And then we'd give them to the typesetting guy, and he would, I think actually it was Matt who typed it all in and then gave it to his buddy, Mike Beamer, if I recall correctly. And the guy would give us these sheets of typesetting, and then we'd sit down and paste these things up. And, the end result is, the book everyone knows and loves.
Yeah.
I did most of the art. Mike Kacharski did some art and some logos, like headers. And the book looked great. I mean, it looked really nice. We pasted that baby up. And the cover, so I couldn't afford full color, which is why it's black and red, which is sort of a classic. And people love it. I'm wearing the t-shirt.
Oh, yeah. It's a very iconic cover.
And that was, I can't know if you can see it well. Yeah. That's the back cover. So these are the original. I still have the original art. So that's the front cover. And that's the back cover.
Oh, yeah.
And I did, like I said, most of the inside art was my pencil art. And again, because it took like 2 or 3 years to get to this point after I even started my company, all the art, most of the stuff was written, most of it was illustrated. It was just waiting to have the money and resources to do it. So we did, and I had some people help me with editing. I had some people help me with the layout, well, not layout, but the paste ups. I did all the art direction and design elements, and we sent it to McNaughton and Gunn and printed 5,000 or 6,000 copies initially, and people loved it. Again, getting it out into the stores was tough, and I also had the struggle of. So no one else was doing perfect bound soft books at that time. It was a new technique. So we were the first to pioneer it in role-playing games. In fact, it would be like 4 or 5 years later before anyone else started doing it on any kind of regular basis. And by 1990, it was the industry norm.
Yeah.
Throughout the 90s, and still is. I mean, people do a lot of hardcovers because you can get them printed in China for about the same cost of getting a soft cover done.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. But this was new back then, and we printed up the books and had them stored on my back porch. We had an enclosed back porch at this little tiny house that I was living in, and that had become our studio. So I had a bedroom that I lived in. I had another bedroom. These are really small bedrooms. That was basically my library. And then a front room, the dining room, was my art studio, writing studio, and of course a kitchen. And we stored the books on the back porch. And as more books would come in, it filled up the living room. And, at some point we had to get a little, like 2,000 square foot warehouse. But anyway, that's a year or so in the future. So my big struggle with this, because I wanted people, so the art back in the day was not particularly impressive. So I wanted people to be able to open up the book.
Yeah, and see the art.
See the art. And be able to read it and go, well, what is a Night Stalker dragon? Holy crap, a 7-headed Hydra. What are the stats? What is this? I wanted people to see it. I'm thinking this is a selling point. But because the perception in the day was, oh man, these are delicate because they're not hardcovers and they're not in a box. We should shrink wrap it for good little old Palladium. We'll be doing them a favor.
No.
I had to fight so hard with so many distributors to please don't shrink wrap my books. And I'd still walk into stores and there'd be my book nicely shrink wrapped. And I'm like,
Defeats the purpose.
Exactly. But again, all this was a new concept. The format, the quality of the art, all of it was weirdly, back in the day, it was kind of revolutionary.
Yeah.
So we had been trying to get, for the longest time, Windmill Hobbies, which back in the day was the #1 mom and pop independent distributor.
Okay.
And to really be anybody in the industry, you needed to get these guys. And I just couldn't get them. And we had talked about in a previous chat that what I would do is I would send the physical books. I had a list of distributors, like 50 distributors. And I would send a physical copy of every book we came out with to these people. So one day the phone rings, I pick it up, and it's Windmill Hobbies. And I'm like, holy crap. And the guy's like, and it kind of gruff. And it turns out it was the owner. He's a really great guy, wonderful guy. And he's like, yeah, send me like 50 of these 3 weapon books, and send me, 20 of this, mechanoid thing. And, give me like 100 of this. And I'm like, oh, you got it. And by the way, you're going to be really happy with the sales. I'm selling to most of your competitors and they're doing great with it. And he's like, no shit, kid. Why do you think I'm buying your books? And I'm like, oh. Sorry.
And it took off.
And it took off. Well, so it was funny because, oh man, the owner's name escapes me at this moment. Sweet guy, kind of cantankerous. He was just kind of always like rough and cantankerous.
Was it Joe?
Joe Budrick, yes. Thank you. Joe Budrick, great guy. We became to be pretty close. And he was so impressed with this frickin' book that, so I should explain first that the independent distribution system sells on a non-returnable basis, which means if you're a store and you buy 6 copies of this and you only sell 3, you're still stuck with those other 3.
The other 3, yep.
And hopefully they'll sell eventually. And you never know. It's always kind of a crapshoot if you're a store. Retailers will tell you never know exactly what's going to take off. If you did, you had that crystal ball, things would be wonderful, but you don't have a crystal ball. So it's part guesswork and part knowing your market and what you think your market area is interested in. Like if everyone's into science fiction and you get a fantasy game, maybe that won't sell so well. So you want to get fewer copies.
And trusting your distributor, right? Because at that point, I mean, even to this day, I mean, I managed a game store, and like I had a relationship with my distributor who said, like, listen, this is going to be hot. Why don't you wait off on these? We really don't have any sales numbers on this thing, but if you're interested, I'll get it for you. But like,
exactly.
The distributor has sort of the 1,000-foot view of where everything is at in their network. So you really have to also like have a good relationship with the distributor to trust them that they're saying, hey, this is the game to get.
And hope that they're correct.
Yeah.
Which I'll get to that story when we talk about Robotech.
Oh, okay.
But they're not, I mean, they usually have their finger on the pulse of the market, but not always. So Joe did the unprecedented thing of calling his major accounts and saying, I want you to take 4 copies of this book. Yeah, I know you never heard of it. Never heard of Palladium Books. Never heard of this role-playing game. I'm telling you, it's great. You want it. I want you to take 4 copies, and whatever you haven't sold in a month, I'll take back. Which is called returnable sales.
Yeah, I mean, that's how book distributors typically work.
Yes, the big book distributors. Yeah. I was blown away.
Yeah.
He didn't, come on, Joe didn't have to do that.
No, I mean, that's a huge leap of faith and trust and, respect for the product to say, listen, I'll take this back on my own dime if this doesn't work out for you.
Exactly, because he's buying them from me on a non-returnable basis.
Yeah.
It's not like he came to me and said, hey, let's work out some kind of deal. He just took it upon himself to do that. Although he's one of the guys that had to fight for years to, Joe, quit. Please quit. You're handcrafting my books. Please. I'm begging you.
They'll sell better if you do.
So, it's fun. The early days, at the time, it feels kind of crazy, and you're under stress and hoping things will work out. But looking back at it, it was pretty hilarious.
Yeah,
and a wonderful experience. And Palladium Fantasy just really started to take off for us, and everything was starting to take off. This is 1983, and at this point, I've got an idea for my next book. Well, I had an idea for what my next source book was going to be.
Yes.
Which is that's the original painting by me. This is the cover. So this is a sort of an example of a cover mock-up. So red reproduces black, which is why you have the red there. And that was the actual key line that we sent for the book. And so I was already working on this and my next role-playing game, which was going to be Heroes Unlimited. And everyone, so because I'm a comic book guy, I mean, big-time comic book guy, I already had thousands of comic books. I'd read tens of thousands of comic books in my short lifetime. I was so into it. Everyone assumed I would do a superhero game.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't there. And people don't understand the creative process. It just wasn't there. I was really into fantasy at the time, and this is where everything was. And every time I said, I'm going to do this fantasy game, people were like, you mean superhero game? And I'm like, no, I'm going to do a fantasy game. They're like, but what about superheroes? You're a superhero guy. And I'm like, I'm a science fiction and fantasy guy too.
Sometimes we just need to let our subconscious work on something and mull it over until it'll eventually bubble back to the surface and in a more complete state.
Exactly. I call it letting an idea percolate.
Yep.
In the back of your head. It just kind of bubbles and boils, and while you're focused on all kinds of other exciting projects.
So we've talked a lot about how the system developed and how the publishing things came together. I'd love to take a little bit of time because Palladium Fantasy, again, we talked about it, a lot of games in this early zeitgeist of the role-playing industry was, hey, we're going to give you maybe an implicit setting, but we're not going to give you an actual setting. And Palladium Fantasy has has a setting, right? We have Northern Territories. We've got the Western Empire, Eastern Kingdoms, Mount Timro,
the Great Northern Wilderness.
the Great Northern Wilderness. You've got the lands of the damned, the Yinsoth jungles, all kind of pieced together. So let me ask, how did this world develop? I mean, the other thing I have so many questions, but let's start with how did this world develop? Where were you pulling your inspirations from?
Well, I get ideas from everything.
Yeah.
I often joke around saying that I'm the victim of an overactive imagination. But just everything gives me ideas, and I knew what I liked, and then so a lot of the actual world was developed while I was gaming with the Defilers. So depending on what adventures we went on, so the Defiler game started off with the Palladium of Desires, which was this magical tower that was like notorious in history, because one day this very common-looking guy, I mean, clean and neat, but just not dressed in gold and not dressed in silks, comes up to the small kingdom that was in this area on the edge of the Great Northern Wilderness and Ophid's grasslands.
Yeah.
And although I just described it as a wilderness, because when I started my game, there was no Ophid's grasslands. Right. And I knew more or less what I wanted a Great Northern Wilderness to be. But my focus was on my dungeon, which is the Palladium of Desire. So this man shows up to the king and queen and says, I want to invite you and all of the townspeople to join me. I'm going to have this massive festival in my new domicile that'll be like 50 miles or 20 miles outside of town, and everyone is welcome. And they're like, outside of our town? And they all kind of laugh, and they assume this guy is just sort of this eccentric oddball, and they treat him nicely, and they're like, thank you, sir, and they pat him on the back, and we appreciate the invitation. And by the way, he had to explain that he's the world's greatest wizard, and that he was going to have this massive thing, and he explains it's the Palladium Desire, and the Palladium Desire is so named because whatever your heart's desire is, I will grant it, within reason.
Right, yeah.
And he, they're like, thanks, buddy, and they escort him out, and the next day, someone runs into the king and queen, and they're like, holy crap, there's this 50 or 100-foot golden tower, not just golden, it's solid gold tower. But when you try to scratch it to get to the gold, get some gold dust, you can't. It's like indestructible. But more than that, O king, there's a line of like 10,000 people waiting to get into the Palladium of Desire, and there's dwarves and elves and trolls and demons and angels and demigods, and no one's fighting, because that's how powerful this wizard, the Nameless Lord, is, and that's how much he's revered. And so for a long, long time, everything was great. The town prospered because all these people are coming to the Palladium of Desire. And you could go in there, and the cool thing at the time, because he could control space and time. So when you went into the tower, it was much like Doctor Who in the TARDIS. It was much, much larger inside. In fact, as the Defilers found out, you could open up a door, and there's a forest that goes on for as far as the eye can see. And you shut the door, and you go to the next room, and it's like an ordinary room, or maybe it's some other landscape, and they're like, holy Moses. So everything is swell until one day, and there's many rumors about what happened. No one knows for sure. But the most popular rumor was that some dark god decided he wanted the Palladium Desire for himself, and started to challenge and fight the Nameless Lord. And as to not disturb his guests, the Nameless Lord took this battle to some unknown dimension, where perhaps they're fighting to this day, which is now like 200 years later.
Right.
Or another rumor was that it was a fight to the death, and while the Nameless Lord won and slew the demon lord, he himself was mortally wounded and had collapsed. But maybe he's even still alive if it was a time hole.
Yeah.
But anyway, without the Nameless Lord to control everything and everybody, once people started to realize that he was gone, chaos broke out. There were massive fights and battles, and no one knew the secrets of the Palladium of Desire. So 200 years later, it's just this place that's filled with God knows what. There's rumors of massive treasures and portals to other worlds if you're brave enough to venture into them. But lots of adventurers and heroes go into the Palladium of Desire. Few ever come back. And that's the setup for my game. And that's where the Defilers went in and went to explore. And it was just a blast. So a lot of my world developed based on the needs or desires of my players. So, for example, we had all kinds of wonderful adventures, and I already had, because I don't like being contained, and if you can do something in a logical way, in a fun way, I want to do it. So I already had a vampire kingdom level. I had that was level 4. Level 5 was the techno level, which I incorporated a bunch of the weapons and technology and stuff that you've seen in mechanoids for the humans. They ran into, again, being a big Marvel comic guy, there was some point where they ran into Killraven.
Oh, yeah.
War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
Right? And they got teleported to his world and were helping him battle the Martians because it's based on War of the Worlds. All this stuff. They ran into a crazy wizard who kept blithering on in sort of an incoherent way about the magic or the science of magic and technology.
Yeah.
How you can blend them. And so one of my guys got turned into like a cyborg, and another one was turned into sort of a Fantastic Four thing-like creature. He called himself the Orange Crush. All these elements are there. So the guys say, we are dying to fight vampires. And I'm like, okay. I'm going to make the greatest vampire adventure the world has ever seen. And it was the biggest level I ever created. It was this massive thing. And again, because there was this blend of magic and technology throughout the Palladium of Desire, they would get to the next level by going into an elevator. And they're at the elevator, and they're about to hit level 4 when one of those guys, in fact, it was frickin' Tom or his brother Ken, Tom Bartold or Ken, who says, we're always going down into the dungeon. What's outside? What's around the Palladium of Desire? And I'm like, come on, boys. Vampire Kingdom, it's waiting for you. This is what you've been wanting. And someone else goes, yeah, what else is there? I'd like to know too. And someone else says, we should go adventuring. And I'm like, no, vampires, it's what you've been dying for. And hopefully not literally. And they're like, no. And before I know it, all 26 of those bozos are like, yeah, let's go adventuring outside. I have no idea what's around other than the Palladium town.
Yeah.
And so that's where I start thinking about things, and they went on like a witch hunting adventure that night. But then, when I get home, I'm like, well, shoot, they still want to go adventuring. I got to figure out what's out here. And the next thing you know, I have Ophid's grasslands that's dominated by bugbears, and there's this weird area that is rumored to be a place of power and can take you to other parts of the world. And then I developed more of the Great Northern Wilderness and the Wolfen.
Yeah.
And then at some point,
one of my favorite races, that whole, the Wolfen and their very Romanesque analog, that was the hook for me to get into Palladium Fantasy.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a history buff, so was Eric
Mhm.
Wojcik, and one of our favorite time periods was, the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
So I got the idea of turning them into Romanesque
Yeah.
Imperial Rome. What if it was Wolfen? Which Eric went nuts over. He was like, "Oh my God, Kev, this is great!" Which is why when it was time to write more about the Wolfen,
Yeah.
Eric contributed to this and came up with the 9 tribes or 12 tribes, and it was just great. So again, it was a matter of at some point the guys and I had created a Timro kingdom because I figured I needed some big kingdom, and I created the Eastern Territories, which
Yeah.
was sort of this. In my mind, it was kind of like Revolutionary War era colonization. So it's partially colonized, but there's all kinds of outposts. Everyone's claiming, land, and so it's kind of a free for all, mostly wilderness zone. And then the Great Northern Wilderness is really inspired from, again, sort of when settlers first came to the New World,
Yeah.
Canada and Eastern and Northern, what would become, United States. It was just this vast, sprawling wilderness. It was just this great wilderness that went on and on and on. That was inspiration for that. I forget where the Land of the Damned came from idea, but that was an early idea that I came up with. And then at some point, my group's like, you know what? It'd be fun fighting pirates. And I'm like,
I see his
okay.
adventures. Yeah.
So I came up with pirates, and that's where I decided, Land of the South Winds is sort of the secret pirate hub. The government says, oh no, there's no pirates here. We hate pirates. We hunt pirates because everyone else around us are pissed off about the pirates. We don't endorse them at all. But it's kind of one of those wink, wink, nod, nod. Oh, this gentleman, you think he's a pirate? No. He found this ship scuttled, and yeah. And so it's funny. Like there's been portions of my world as I develop it, like the Land of the South Winds, where I've had several writers turn in what they think it is, and it's not. And that's the funny part is I'll read these things and I'll be like, but this isn't the Land of the South Winds. I know. I've been there.
Yep. Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the Defilers and how they were foundational to this, and I've always wondered. So the Defilers and their longer name, the Defilers of Beelzebub. It's not a typical hero group name, right? It's usually protectors or champions or. Where did the name the Defilers come from, and why was Beelzebub the big bad evil that slowly revealed themselves to the group, or did you have that in mind at the beginning, or?
Oh heck no! So one of the main players, who happened to call himself the Nameless One, no relations to the Nameless Lord. He was this priest of light and dark, and but he was looking for a god that he could really represent, and so I came up with this semi-forgotten god, or actually it wasn't semi; he was long forgotten god named Narabium, and Narabium actually appeared to him and would, he would make prayers, and the guy just rolled really good. And he'd be like, can I get this miracle, whatever? And he rolls like a 3. And I'm like, yes. and so he played. So all of my Defilers were just outstanding players, very much into role playing. So he really played up I need to bring this forgotten god back to prominence.
Mm-hmm.
So he would represent the god all the time, and like the Defilers would save some town or city or, prince or whoever. And, they would take the reward and be like, thanks, that's great. And then Nameless would walk up and go, and the god responsible for this is Narabium. You should build a shrine, or you should build a temple. Or when we come back, I expect to see a shrine or a temple, or whatever. And sometimes he would even donate so much gold for them to do so. But we'll be back. And they're so grateful, like, yeah, absolutely, Narabium, rah, that's great. Yeah. So into Palladium Desire, it's very to say it's a hostile environment is an understatement. Only some of the most powerful and wicked things could survive in this uncontrolled place.
Yeah.
So they, for example, ran into a mad god. And it's funny because they would do classic. They were so comic book playing. It was funny. It just played right into my strengths.
Yeah.
Because I would set them up and say, okay, there's this, someone would come in and go, whatever you do, you're going to see this crazy god with tentacles and whatever. And, it's got two massive, like the size of your fist, emeralds that are worth a fortune for eyes. But whatever you do, don't take them. And of course, especially with 26 players,
somebody's going to want to we got to go do that right now.
Exactly. Even though the principled characters and the scrupulous players are saying, of course we won't do this. We're not thieves. The thieves in the group would be like, most of us
are.
And so, three of these guys, when the group's not looking, climb up into the mad guy and pry out one of the eyeballs, and the frickin' statue comes to life. It's the mad god.
Of course it does.
And so they fought him, and then, people would die, and I would feel bad, and I'd be like, well, they would learn about this pool on level 2 or sub-level of level 2. And there's this goddess, and she'll resurrect people, but there's consequences. So you would have to do some quest for her, do something for her. I'll do this. I'll raise them right now, but you need to do this and by this time period. And it was always something good. And then Narabian would sometimes send them on quests. And anyways, ultimately they started to butt heads with all kinds of evil deities and demon lords. And they would, fight these bad guys or sometimes the gods themselves, and shockingly win. And they would then, it's an evil temple or something, right? So they would defile it. And they would defy these evil gods. And Beelzebub became, because that was a D&D big bad guy, him and Asmodeus.
Asmodeus, yes.
And so Beelzebub in my game was the big bad guy, the Lord of Hell. And they pissed him off so much, he starts sending things after them, quite literally things after them. And they actually go into, I forget if it was church or, I don't think they had gone into hell yet. That was the big send-off end of our 3.5-year campaign. They actually marched into hell, and it was crazy. But we'll talk about that when we do an episode about the Defilers.
I'm looking forward to that. So
anyways, they're battling Beelzebub and a bunch of his minions, and it's just back and forth where, unbelievably they're kicking ass, and then they're really in trouble. And they had really put some damage on Beelzebub. But the tide had turned, and they were in serious trouble. And the Nameless One gets on his knees and prays to Narabian to come and destroy, help them, give them the power to destroy Beelzebub. Well, they don't have that power. He can't grant him that kind of power. So Narabian shows up in person and starts battling Beelzebub along with the player group. And of course, I said as game master, I allowed the killing blow. One of the guys, in fact, it was Lord Coke, throws his magical battle axe and rolls a natural 20. So it's double damage.
Yeah.
And I'm like, Beelzebub screams. There's his axe in his chest, right through his heart. And he starts to shrivel up. But at the same time, he and Arabium had clashed, and Arabium and Beelzebub disappear. And they learn later that Beelzebub is dead, and they suspect so is Narabium. They fucking killed their god. And again, the guy playing Ken Barthold, playing Nameless, is like, that's not true. Our God is still alive, and he's still here, and he protects us, and he would go on forever to establish shrines and churches. He ultimately, because the filers, sort of like Doctor Who, they end up, when you go into the Palladium of Desire, sometimes you go in at noon and you come out at 12:01.
Yeah.
Even though you spent 3 days in the Palladium of Desire. Other times you go in at noon and you come out 5 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was able, the Defilers campaign in game time was like 50 years. So these guys became legends. And there'd be times like, oh, the Defilers are gone and dead, and good riddance if you're a bad guy, saying that. And then they show up and beat them into the ground. And, all the good people are like, yay.
Yeah.
It was just an amazing campaign. And a lot of my ideas grew in the world. The Palladium Fantasy world grew out of a lot of the campaigns and adventure ideas that we played through in that 3.5 years.
That's awesome. So I've got a ton of more questions, but why don't we save those for the next one when we talk about the old ones? Because some of my questions are about the old ones, which are foundational to the Palladium Fantasy world, like where it came from and where all of the different species arose from. And, one of the other things that I always associate with Palladium Fantasy is rune weapons. So I'd like to talk about that because, I'm a huge Michael Moorcock fan, but I came to the idea of rune weapons through Palladium. And then when I read Elric, I was like, yes, I know exactly, like, you should not trust this blade because I know how rune weapons work. This is awful. But let's save that for next time. Like, dear viewer, next time we're going to be talking about old ones, which was the first supplement for Palladium Fantasy.
Actually, the second. The first was Arms of Nargash Tor,
which I have right here.
Yep.
So we'll save Arms of Nargash Tor for the episode after that. Awesome, Kevin. Thank you so much.
Sure.